Please start.
नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स नमो तस् भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा सम्बुद्धस्स. This gives me an immense pleasure to invite you all to the 8th Professor Mikhail Hahn Memorial Lecture. This is a very special event for all of us, and especially the two institutes which are jointly organizing this lecture. So I welcome you all on behalf of the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies of the Savitribai Phule Pune University and the Deshana and Institute of Buddhist and Allied Studies, Pune. Both the institutes have a very close connection with Professor Hahn, and we have been blessed with his support and kindness. And we sincerely feel that whatever we have done in last few years in the field of Buddhist studies and the progress which we have been doing, uh, both the institutes, it is kind of largely indebted to Professor Hahn. So I welcome you all. So this is an event which has a close and very deep emotional impact on all of us, especially the trustees of the Deshana Institute, and who are also connected with the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies. So myself, the president of Deshana Institute, as well as the head of the Department of the Pali and Buddhist Studies Department, Professor Shrikant Bahulkar, who has been the founder member of the Deshana Institute, and as well as the adjunct professor at the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies, Dr. Lata Devkar, secretary of the Deshana Institute, and also the adjunct professor at the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies. Without sparing more time, I would now request Dr. Lata Devkar to speak a few words about Professor Hahn and his relation to these two institutes. So, Lata, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of the Deshana Institute and Deshana Institute of Buddhist and Allied Studies and the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies of the Savitribai Phule Pune University, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on the occasion of 8th Professor Mikhail Hahn Memorial Lecture. Mm, Although most of you have personally known Professor Hahn and have worked with him, I take this opportunity to give a brief introduction of this great scholar. For those who are new to the department, our new students, born on 7th May 1941, Professor Hahn completed his first degree in psychology in 1964 in the University of Marburg. At the same time, he pursued Indology and Tibetology as a second subject. In 1967, he completed his PhD, for which he worked on the Tibetan translation of Jnanashri Mitra's Vrittamala Stuti and continued to work on that text till his last days. He taught Indian and Tibetan studies at the universities of Hamburg from 1968 to 1972, in Bonn from 1972 to 1988, and Marburg as a full professor from 1988 to 2007, where he fostered a number of students and contributed numerous books and articles. The core aim of Hahn's research was to bring to light unknown or hardly known works, especially from the neglected field of Buddhist kavya, through critical editions and annotated translations. In this field, in which he was the leading figure, he excelled through his stupendous command of Sanskrit and Tibetan. his wide reading of primary sources, and his excellent memory, which allowed him, for instance, to identify parallels in Subhashita literature. He liked highly artistic Sanskrit, especially in the form of sophisticated kavyas like Kaphinabhidaya. Among his important publications are Chandragomin's Lokananda Nataka, Haribhatta's Jatakamala, discovery and edition of Gopadatta Jatakamala, Shivaswami's Kaphinabhidaya, Lokasangra Vyavahara Pravrutti, Lokasam Vyavahara Pravrutti, and Arya Kosha of Ravi Gupta. His textbook of classical literary Tibetan has become the choice for any course in classical Tibetan. A large part of his works is visible in his series Indica Tibetica, which he initiated and of which 55 volumes were published during his lifetime. As Mahesh already mentioned, we three, Professor Bahulkar, Mahesh, and I, had a rare opportunity to study and work with this extraordinary scholar from 2012 to 2014. It was through discussions with him that we decided to establish the Deshana Institute and its series Studia Indo-Buddhica. Not only did he choose the name of the series, but also offered three of his works for publication in this series. And still remember that the naming ceremony of this series took place in a hospital in April 2014, where I think he was in ICU, and we went to see him. And Professor Johannes Schneider, who is also a member of the editorial board, was there, and that was the place where the series was named. So not only did he choose the name of the series, but as a blessing, he offered three of his books or works for the series. So according to his wish, we published the Nagari edition of Jnanashri Mitra's Vrittamala Stuti together with Shakya Rakshita's commentary. This was published in Studia Indo-Buddhika in 2016. And in 2019, we published Ravi Gupta's Arya Kosha in the same series. Recently, on the occasion of the Buddha Purnima on 26th May 2021, we published Sankatha, a volume of selected papers presented in the International Conference on Buddhist Narrative Literature held in Pune in 2016 in the memory of Professor Hahn. This was a joint publication of Deshana and department. We are immensely indebted to Professor Mikhail Hahn and are committed to walk on the path shown by this great scholar and mentor. With this, I now request Professor Bahulkar to introduce today's speaker, Professor Hartman. Thank you.
Uh, I think just 1 minute. Before that, I would request Dr. Mrugendra Pratap to say a few words about the Deshana Institute, and then Professor Bahulkar would request would introduce Professor Hartman, and then would request him to speak. So I'll first request Dr. Mrugendra Pratap to introduce the Deshana Institute and its work.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes,
Yes,
yes, you
you're
are
audible,
audible.
Yes.
Mrugendra.
Please.
Please continue.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So, good evening to all of you. I am delighted to share brief information about Desana, an Institute of Buddhist and Allied Studies. The primary meaning of the word Desana is showing direction. This is a mark of the Buddha's teaching, which encourages people to be self-reliant and to strive for their own betterment, following the guidance of teachers. The members of the Buddhist order continued to serve the society by transmitting the same knowledge in the manner of their teacher, the Buddha. These wandering teachers revolutionized entire way of education and through it the society at large. Inspired by such teachers and their unique wisdom, the Desana, an institute of Buddhist and allied studies, was established on the 24th of February 2014 in order to carry forward the great legacy of the Buddhist lineage. The institute Desna, through its dedicated and experienced resource persons having expertise in diverse study areas, offers short-term or long-term courses. The courses of Desna cover languages such as Pali, classical Sanskrit, Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, and classical Tibetan and the Buddhist literature available in them, Indian philosophy, Buddhist meditation, Buddhist art and culture, and contemporary Buddhism. The Desna Institute offers courses on demand and personalized teaching from experienced scholars in the field. All these features ensure greater flexibility.
Mrugendra, we have lost your voice.
Uh, Sir, he disconnected now.
Okay, so yes, let me just continue. There might be some problem at his end at this point. But yes, I mean, the Ishina Institute, as Murugendra was saying, offers personalized teaching and also courses on demand. Besides this, as Lata has already mentioned, we have this publication series, and we have already published 3 books in the from Deshana, and there are a few more publications in pipeline. So we would be soon publishing the 2 volumes of collected papers of Professor M.G. Dharfale, a renowned Pali and Buddhist studies scholar from Pune. Um, yes, so with these introduction of Deshana, now we will turn to our main program for today. I'm indeed very happy that we are having a wonderful audience for today's talk, which includes even Professor Peter Skilling, who delivered last year's Mikhail Hahn Memorial Lecture. We also have Dr. Dragomir Dimitrov here, who was also one of the speakers. Professor Bahulkar is here. And I see in the audience there are many stalwarts of Buddhist studies. And I'm really happy that due to the technology, we are now really being able to reach wider audiences in different continents of the world. So I welcome you all, and I personally am thankful to Professor Hartman for accepting this invitation to speak on this occasion. Professor Hartman, of course, shares a special bond with Professor Hahn, and I'm really happy that this year he is available to deliver the 8th Professor Mikhail Hahn Memorial Lecture. Now I request Professor Bahulkar. I mean, as Lata said, we 3 together studied with Professor Hahn, and I would request Professor Bahulkar now to introduce Professor Hartman, and then he can request Professor Hartman to start the talk for today. So just one announcement before that. After the talk, we will take few questions. It would be good if you could send your questions in a chat box, and then afterwards, Dr. Talat can announce the name of a person, and then you can put your questions. And then we will conclude with a vote of thanks. So with these few instructions, let me now request Professor Bahulkar once again to introduce Professor Hartman. Thank you.
Friends, unfortunately, my camera is not working properly. I do not know what has happened to that, but remaining invisible, I would introduce Professor Hartman in a few words. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jens Uwe Hartman, whom I have known for the past more than 25 years. I say 25 years because I came into his contact some 25 years ago. But by that time, he was already an established scholar of international repute. We first met in Berlin when I was a visiting scholar at the Seminar für Indologie und Kunstgeschichte of Freie Universität Berlin. and he was a professor of Tibetology at the Humboldt University at Berlin. I remember that we met in a coffee shop in Berlin with my friend Professor Harry Falk. Since then, I have been occasionally in contact with him. He was very kind to allow me to publish his magnificent edition of Matrucheta's Varnarha Varna Stotra in the journal The of Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. I had edited that journal in 2012. But this personal reference by no means completes Professor Hartmann's introduction. I find it very difficult to do justice to his contribution to the field of Buddhist studies in a few minutes and few words. As we are all aware, Professor Hartmann is a leading figure in the field of Buddhist studies. He has, to his credit, more than 109 contributions in the form of monographs, co-edited volumes, book chapters, and articles pertaining to his area of interest, namely canonical literature of Buddhism, Buddhist Sanskrit manuscripts from Central Asia and Afghanistan, classical Indian art poetry, current developments of Buddhism in Asia, and Buddhism reception in the West. As we can observe, his research centers on the recovery and reconstruction of Indian Buddhist literature on the basis of Indic manuscripts as well as their translations into Chinese and Tibetan with a focus on canonical texts and works of poetry. His various authored and co-edited works include an edition of the Varnarha Varna Stotra, as I mentioned, Stotra of Matrucheta, a study of the Dirghagama of the Sarvastivadins, the series, namely Buddhist manuscripts devoted to the publication of ancient Indic manuscripts from Afghanistan, and from birch bark to digital data, recent advances in Buddhist manuscripts research. And there are very interesting articles. Many of his articles are in German. I just mention a few of them. One is, if you meet the Buddha, you will kill him. How great is the potential for violence in Buddhism? Next is literature without writing, the special case of India. Here I have some abstract of this article. It says, a millennia-old culture remained without writing for a long time. The oldest evidence of native Indian writing dates from the 3rd century BC. How did people manage to pass on much older works of literature or even the complex grammar of Vedic language without the aid of writing? Another article that interests me is Understanding Heaven and Earth with One Name, the Indian drama Shakuntala, and so on. Professor Hartmann earned his master's degree from Munich. For this degree, he edited and translated the Chandraprabha Avadana based on the Gilgit manuscript. And then later on, he did his Habilitation from Göttingen, for which he worked on the Dirghagama of the Sarvastivadins. After studying in Munich and Göttingen, he held the post of Professor of Tibetology at Humboldt University in Berlin before returning to Munich in 1999. In 2001, he became a full member of the, what's happening? Hello? In 2001, he became a full member of the Bavaria Academy of Sciences and a corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences in 2007. He has held various visiting appointments at visiting professor at the Collège de France, research fellow at the Center of Advanced Study of Norwegian Academy of Sciences in Oslo, visiting professor at the International College of Advanced Buddhist Studies, Tokyo, research professorship at the International Research Institute of Advanced Buddhology at Soka University in Tokyo, visiting professor at the Collège de France again in 2004, Numata visiting professor for Buddhist Studies in University at the University of California, Berkeley, Shinyo and visiting professor at Stanford University, fellow at the Kate Hamburger College, that is Dynamics in the History of Religions between Asia and Europe at the Ruhr University, Bochum, and recently he has been appointed a distinguished fellow at the Max Weber Kolleg at the University of Erfurt in Germany. With this brief introduction, I welcome Professor Hartmann, our senior friend and Guru Bandhu, and welcome him to begin his lecture. Thank you very much.
First, the question, can you see me and can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Yeah.
Talat can confirm whether he can
Yes,
see
we
you.
can see
Yes,
you.
Professor Hart. Yes, Professor, we can see you on the
Excellent.
screen and we can hear you properly. Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
please.
you very much. Respected audience, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, a word of thanks to my old friend Shrikant, who introduced me in a very personal way. It's very, very nice. Thank you so much, Shrikant. It brought the Berlin days back to memory, and
Yes.
it was an enjoyable time, actually.
Yeah, true. Thanks, sir. Thank you.
So now it's a great pleasure to meet so many friends and colleagues in this digital room from all over the world. And I wish to thank the organizers, especially Mahesh and his wife Lata, for inviting me to give this lecture. I feel very honored, since this is not just any lecture. Many of you will be aware of the fact that I knew Michael Hahn quite well and that I owe him a lot. And this occasion offers me a chance to express my gratitude to him, and I will do so with a few words about how we met. And this will lead quite naturally to the topic of my lecture. In summer 1978, Michael Hahn had become director of the Nepal-German Manuscript Preservation Project in Kathmandu, and he was looking for an assistant who should accompany him to Nepal. My teacher in Munich, Adelheid Mette, knew Hahn well and recommended me to him. I had written my master thesis on an Avadana, Shrikant mentioned that, the Chandra Prabha Avadana, and that was very lucky because Hahn was quite interested in this genre, and he invited me for an interview. In August 78, I went to his home near Bonn and introduced myself. From the very first moment, he was extremely nice to me, and we talked a lot throughout the day. A few days later, Hahn phoned and told me that I was selected, provided I was able to accept within 2 or 3 days and ready to arrive in Nepal in the beginning of October. A few weeks later, I boarded a plane to Delhi, first flight in my life, and changed there to a Nepalese plane, first time outside of Europe. And on a bright October morning, I arrived in Kathmandu. Hahn had rented a house and suggested me to stay with him, which I gladly accepted. And then we spent 1 year under the same roof. And thinking back, I'm still amazed how Hahn treated me during this time. Of course, he was always fond of having people around him whom he could tell about his scholarly work. He never tired in talking about ancient Buddhist Sanskrit texts, and especially poetical works like, for instance, the Haribhatta Jataka Mala, which at that time was very important for him. Amazing was the way he did it. He always treated me as a younger equal, and he could talk in such a way that even a seemingly boring topic started to reveal its fascinating aspects. I learned a lot during that time, not least about how much fun it was to deal with difficult Buddhist caviar. And this is already the point of transition. But before I turn to my topic, the Tridanda Mala, I would like to repeat how grateful I am to Michael Hahn, and not only for his extremely stimulating company, for his friendship, but also for taking me to Nepal. This was an important step in my career, and I should add, an unforgettable adventure at the time. Now, Michael would have loved the text I'm going to introduce to you. I will speak about a word with a strange title, Tridanda Mala, and I will divide my lecture, and now I will try to share the screen. is it successful?
Yes, yes, Professor. Please continue.
Perfect.
Please.
Because I can't see it. So please, whenever something goes wrong, please tell me.
Sure, definitely,
So
sure.
I will divide my lecture into 7 sections. But first, a word of relief, perhaps. I was asked to talk for 1 hour, but it should be something like 50 to 55 minutes if no major digital catastrophes happen. Now, the 7 topics. First, history of research. Then, second, the manuscript. Third, the structure of the text. Fourth, the doctrine. Fifth, poetry. Sixth, ritual, which is in a way the most difficult point. And seventh, the author. It is not difficult to see that the last 4 points are simply adopted from the title of my lecture. Excuse me if I take it more or less for granted that you do not know very much about this text and perhaps even nothing. I beg the pardon of those who are already well versed in this text, but regarding the others, I think it makes sense to start from the very beginning. The text became known to the scholarly world in 1938 when the famous Rahula Sankrityayana published his 3rd report on Sanskrit manuscripts in Tibet. In the 30s, Rahula had undertaken 3 travels to southern Tibet in the search for Sanskrit manuscripts, accompanied by a highly educated Tibetan, the no less famous Skandenshunde. In various monasteries, they found a wealth of manuscripts, and Rahula published a survey of his findings in several installments. During their 3rd trip, they also visited Pukang Monastery and saw a text with the Sanskrit title Tridanda Mala. In his survey, Rahula quoted from the beginning and the end of the manuscript, and the colophon clearly stated that Ashvaghosha was the author of this work. Sankrityayana's quotation showed that the text seemed to consist of a mixture of stanzas and prose. His excerpts reached up to folio 3a of the manuscript, and they indicated that the text contained at least 1 sutra quotation from one of the agamas, since line 3 of the 2nd folio preserved the standard opening formula of a sutra, evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaya, and so on and so forth. Before this sutra, in prose, there were only verses. Now, could this really be a work of Ashvaghosha, the towering figure among early Buddhist poets, the writer of 2 exemplary Mahakavyas, Buddha Charita and the Soundarananda, and the author of at least 3 or 4 plays, among them the Shariputra Prakarana? Let me add a word about Ashvaghosha here for those who are not so familiar with him, because this is important in order to understand the following and be able to properly appreciate it. If India was still a Buddhist country, I dare say that Ashvaghosha would be no less renowned than Kalidasa, and probably even more. Ashvaghosha is earlier than Kalidasa, perhaps 1st or 2nd century, and he is the first known author of both the genre of Mahakavya, the epic, and of Nataka, the play. In other words, he seems to live right at the beginning of the time when Sanskrit became used for a refined poetics, which was characterized by specific genres, and he was perhaps one of those who significantly contributed to this development. Now back to the question, could the Tridanda Mala be a work of Ashvaghosha? Of course not. It was completely out of the question, and this verdict did not come from anyone but from Edward Hamilton Johnston, an excellent Sanskritist who had edited both the Buddha Charita and the Soundarananda, and naturally was the specialist for everything connected with the name of Ashvaghosha. In 1939, only a year after the publication of Sankrityaya's report, Johnston already published a short note in which he reached the conclusion that Ashwagosha had to be ruled out as the author of the text. He deduced this from a comparison between, quote, the three certain works of Ashwagosha whose Sanskrit texts are wholly or partly preserved, end of quote. And these are the three texts listed on the slide. And the extracts from the Tridandamala presented by Sankrityayana, where he found none of the characteristics of Ashwagosha's, quote again, highly individual style, which is easily recognizable, end of quote. Very soon you will see that Johnston's judgment was at least in part quite wrong. And I'm sure that Johnston himself would have been the first to admit it. The question is, could he have known better? I think the answer is no. And this brings me to the last point in the history of research. It is well known that Rahula Sankrityayana did not only excerpt from the manuscripts, but also took photographs of a number of them. When we study the collection of his photographs, we find that the Tridandamala is included among them. Then why didn't Johnston simply ask for copies of these photographs, but contented himself with Sankrityayana's excerpts? The answer is surprising, and it's surprisingly easy. Sankrityayana simply did not photograph the manuscript himself. How then did the photographs of the Tridandamala slip into his collection? This is the moment to introduce another great scholar, the Italian Giuseppe Tucci. Tucci visited Pökang Monastery only a year later in 1939. And here you see Tucci in a Tibetan monastery. I don't think it's Pökang. And he took photographs of the manuscript. We owe this information and access to the photographs to our colleague Francesco Sfera in Naples, who takes care of Tucci's scholarly legacy. When we compare Tucci's photographs with those found in Sankrityayana's collection, it immediately becomes evident that they are identical. How is this possible? The riddle is solved in a lecture given by Tucci in Kyoto in 1955. And there Tucci reported on his stay at Pökang and mentioned that he photographed the text. He also disclosed that Sankrityayana had been in a rather bad condition when he visited Pökang, and that it had been difficult or impossible for him to take photographs. Tucci announced an edition after his return from Japan, although he never found time to realize that project. He must have put copies of his photographs at Sankrityayana's disposal. Sankrityayana himself only copied the beginning and end of the manuscript by hand. In other words, when Johnston wrote his judgment on the authorship of the Tridandamala, all he had at his disposal was Sankrityayana's excerpts published in the report, which had appeared in 1938. And this brings us to my second point. No, sorry, I have to try to go back because this is important. Okay, I hope you can see what I see, a look at the manuscript, and this slide shows you how the photograph. How the photographs were taken. Please look at the hand in the upper left corner for getting an idea about the proportions and about how the folios were photographed. The lengthy palm leaves were fixed with pins. Here you see the pins on a wooden board. Rather bad is the fact that the focus usually is either more to the right side, as you can see here. Here it's clear, here it's blurred, or more to the left side. In quite a few folios, up to 1/3 is blurred and therefore extremely difficult, if not impossible, to read. This is a great pity, to put it mildly. It is completely unclear if this manuscript is still available and if it was included in the new and very beautiful facsimile edition of Sanskrit manuscripts in Tibet, which, however, is inaccessible in any case. Since we are already viewing the manuscript, we might as well take a look at the final folio with the colophon. The yellow arrow marks the last folio, and the text starts here samapta, with the sentence samapta cheyam tridandamala kirtya acharya stabira ashvagoshasya shakya bhikshoch sarvastivadino mahavadinach. Finished is this Tridandamala, a work of the teacher, the elder member of the order, Ashvagosha, the Buddhist monk, follower of the Sarvastivada, the eloquent. The word Maha is inserted below the line, you can see it here. With the translation eloquent for Mahavadin, I follow Johnston's translation of the colophon of the sounder Ananda, but I should add that neither the exact meaning of Mahavadin nor the precise reference of the term Shakya Bhikshu are fully determined. I would like to add two more informations on the manuscript. First, that it consists of altogether 115 folios. It's not quite short. And second, the Tridandamala was photographed together with another text, a Parikatha, which is presently being studied by Peter Daniel Santo. Since no title is affixed to this text, Santo provisionally names it Saddharma Parikatha. He considers it to be a preacher's manual on how to provide sermons for the laity, both Brahmanical and Buddhist laity. I will briefly come back to it. Now, this concludes the section on the manuscript, and we will now turn to the structure of the text. It consists of 40 chapters. There are no chapter colophons, but this division becomes clear from the fact that the same structure is repeated 40 times. Each chapter has a three-part division, and this is the moment to consider the strange title. What does Tridandamala really mean? Johnston, in his paper of 1939, concluded that Tridanda could not refer to the stuff of a non-Buddhist ascetic. Instead, he came up with a rather fanciful explanation that does not need to be repeated here. Instead, it seems obvious that Tridanda refers to the structure, and that the whole title means something like garland of tripartite sections. I will come back to the term Tridanda when we look at the function, the section I named ritual. How is each chapter organized? There are the three sections, obviously the dandas. The second section invariably consists of a canonical sutra, which forms the core of each chapter. The remainder of the chapter consists exclusively of verses. Each chapter begins with a verse section, and it concludes with another verse section. Basically, the verses in the first and third danda are connected with the topic of the sutra, but they show a great variety concerning their number and the degree of the connection. There is a certain underlying structure, but this is handled quite loosely. The first section always starts with a triad of verses of homage to the three jewels. Then a kind of prologue verse on the sutra topic may follow, or immediately verse quotations from various sources. Another verse may follow, which introduces the sutra. Then the sutra itself follows, and the third danda may begin with an epilogue verse. And then again, as in the first danda, verse quotations from various sources will follow, sometimes followed by another epilogue verse. And each chapter invariably ends with 2 or 3 stanzas which request the protection of the Dharma and exhort to practice the Buddha's teaching. These stanzas are recurringly quoted, and some of them are found also in other Buddhist literature. From my overview, you can already guess that the most thrilling part are the verses in the first and third dandas. But before I come to them, I will say something about the middle danda, the sutra quotations. What kind of sutras are quoted here, and where do they come from? And this brings us to my fourth section, doctrine. To summarize the results, the sutras are quoted in full. They are in Sanskrit, and most likely they are taken from the canonical scriptures of the Mula Savastivadins. Why? There are two, perhaps three main reasons. Whenever a sutra can be related to a canonical source, it will be either the Chinese translation of a Savastivada, Mula Savastivada Agama, as for instance the Samyukta Agama, or we will have a Sanskrit parallel from Central Asia. Just two examples. The first is the Pravarana Sutra, a text connected with the Pravarana ceremony, an important rite of the Buddhist order at the end of the rainy season. The sutra is preserved in the Chinese translation of the Samyuktagama, and I reconstructed the Central Asian version from fragments of altogether 15 Central Asian manuscripts. Please remember this figure. It's very high for a sutra from those finds, and I come back to it. This reconstruction is not yet published, and therefore I have to say a word or two. The oldest of the Central Asian manuscripts is an early palm leaf manuscript, which must have been imported from India, and which shows some peculiarities. The Pravarana Sutra contained in the Tridanda Mala shares all of these peculiarities. It's amazing. The early palm leaf manuscript found in Central Asia on paleographical grounds to be dated approximately to the 4th century, and the late palm leaf manuscript found in Tibet, probably from the 11th century, represent the same northern Indian version of the sutra. It is remarkable to see that this version was kept completely stable for at least 700 years. And most likely it is the one used by the school of the Mula Savastivadins. My second example is the Aryika Sutra, again found in the Chinese translation of the Samyuktagama, but also in the Tibetan translation of the Muktaka, which is part of the Vinaya of the Mula Savastivadins. This sutra deals with the death of King Prasenajit's beloved grandmother, Aryika's grandmother, then the king's grief and the Buddha's consolation. 4 years ago, I published a partial reconstruction of the Sanskrit text of the sutra, making use of a few Central Asian fragments, and now I found an identical version preserved in the Tridanda Mala. The fact that the text of the Aryika Sutra is also preserved in the Vinaya of the Mula Savastivadins further strengthens the connection with this specific Agama tradition. And these two examples should suffice. More could be added, but they only confirm the observation. Of course, the question remains, what could be the reason for selecting those specific sutras? Is there a uniting factor for all of them? I will come back to these questions in the 6th section, the section on ritual, and this may already give you a hint at the common ground of all these texts, and it will be another confirmation for a Mula Savastivada background of the sutras. Now, but finally, it's time to turn to poetry. And this would have been the exact moment when Michael Hahn had pricked up his ears and listened most attentively. Dogmatics was not at the center of his interest, but with poetry, one always ran into open doors. Before we do so, however, it's necessary to say a few words about how I came to take interest in the text. My friend and colleague Kazunobu Matsuda in Kyoto had started to work on this text, and on August 9 in 2018, he invited me to join him. I could not resist the invitation, and Kazunobu started to send me his transliterations, and I started to check them. 2 weeks later, on August 25, I could identify the first verse from the second half of the Buddha Charita. It was verse 76 of chapter 16, and I show it briefly to you, Sharirenda, Buddhibhyo, Nahi Anyarupalabhyate, and so on. And this was a real breakthrough. Why? As you may know, the Sanskrit original of the second half of the Buddha Charita is missing. Suddenly, there was hope that the Tridanda Mala would turn out to be a gold mine of lost verses from Ashwagosha. This was our immediate expectation 3 years ago, and it has not been disappointed at all. Let me impress you with some figures concerning Ashwagosha's two Mahakavyas, the Buddha Charita and the Soundarananda. The Soundarananda is the shorter one of the two epics. It consists of 1,063 stanzas in 18 chapters or cantos, as Johnston translates it. So far, we have found 166 stanzas quoted in the Tridandamala, and this represents more than 15% of the Soundarananda. Its Sanskrit text is completely preserved, and therefore the quotations corroborate or sometimes improve readings, and they show that the compilers or redactors of the Tridandamala knew the Soundarananda quite well, either by heart or they had access to a manuscript. More impressive are the figures for the Buddha Charita. This epic is twice as long as the Soundarananda. It consists of all together 2,109 verses, according to Johnston's counting. They are divided into 28 cantos. However, only the first 1,033 stanzas are preserved in Sanskrit. The single manuscript Johnston had to work from breaks off in chapter 14. In other words, 1,076 stanzas were lost with only a very few exceptions. Friedrich Weller could recover parts of 16 verses, small parts of 16 verses, from a fragmentary Central Asian manuscript, which he published in 1953. And 3 verses of Canto 28 are quoted in the Divyavadana. So far, we found 183.5 verses of the Buddha Charita, which corresponds to only 8.7% of the whole text. But more interesting is the distribution. Only 45 verses come from the first part, which would correspond to 4.4%, but 138.5 verses from the second part. And this amounts to nearly 13% of the text not preserved in Sanskrit. And this is a lot. On first sight, the relation between 45 verses of the first half against 138 of the second may appear astonishingly imbalanced. However, this is easily explained by the contents. Canto 14, the last canto partly preserved in Sanskrit, describes the awakening. And only with the lost Canto 15, the teaching of the Buddha begins. Cantos 15 to 28 describe the life of the Buddha with his teachings and his winning of disciples up to his final nirvana. And naturally, this latter part contains all the contents that are apt to be quoted in a somehow dogmatic context. When I said so far we found 183 verses, it means that most likely there will be some more, which we have not yet found, since we have not read every passage. And you will remember that there are parts of the manuscript which are simply illegible. And this is the moment to acknowledge Kazunobu Matsuda's great contribution. He is extremely good in deciphering passages, which seem to resist any attempt at reading them. And he has transliterated most of the manuscripts, since he is much more familiar with the script than I am. So we owe it to him, basically. I should add a few words about the distribution of the quotations in the Tridandamala. They are found all over the verse sections, sometimes a single verse, but often a couple of connected verses, and in one case, even a whole chapter. The first Danda of Tridanda 34 contains the complete Canto 15 of the Buddha Charita, verses 1 to 58, followed by 4 verses from Gopadatta's Ajata Shatru Avadana. In the second Danda follows the Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra, that is the first sermon of the Buddha and very auspicious in the Tibetan tradition. In 2 days, the Dharma Chakra Pravartana will be celebrated. And the third Danda contains 38 verses of Canto 16 of the Soundarananda, followed by the usual benediction verses. The Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra is framed, as it were, by 100 stanzas of Ashwagosha. Amazing, isn't it? Canto 15 of the Buddha Charita is a poetical adaptation of the Dharma Chakra Pravartana episode, and Canto 16 of the Soundarananda is devoted to basically the same topic, an exposition of the Four Truths. Here, the connection between the embedded sutra and the accompanying verses is fully transparent. This is not always the case, but, or perhaps more correct, we do not always see the exact point of reference. So far, we have 350 stanzas from the Buddha Charita and the Soundarananda. Is there more in the Tridandamala that connects with the name of Ashwagosha? Indeed, there is. In the Tanjore section, the Tibetan Buddhist canon preserves a word with the Tibetan title Nyangen Selva and the Sanskrit title Shokka Vinodana. Both mean the same consolation of grief. The colophon gives Acharya Ashwagosha as the author and lists the Indian Upadhyaya Ajita Shribhadra and the Tibetan Shakya Ö as translators and revisers. If these names are correct, the translation may stem from the 11th century, then it is late. And this makes it difficult to speculate about the author, about the correctness of the inscription. The work consists of 40 Tibetan shlokas. It deals with the inevitability of human death, which is illustrated with a number of interesting examples and comparisons. In the academic world, this work seems to have gone unnoticed so far. A while ago, I explained that the Tridandamala manuscript was photographed together with another text, a Parikatha, and that this Parikatha is being studied by Peter Daniel Santo. Chapter 11 of this manual deals with the subject of Shokka Vinodana. And in his search for possible parallels, Santo had a look into the 14th chapter of the Tridandamala and found two sets of 20 stanzas in Anushtup meter, which treated this topic. And when he compared them with the Tibetan translation of the Shokka Vinodana, they turned out to represent its Sanskrit original. With the help of this Sanskrit text, I could identify a fragment of a Central Asian Sanskrit manuscript. And since this fragment preserves verse numbers, it is clear that it must have contained the whole text originally. But not enough. Based on our findings, Kazunobu Matsuda quickly identified a translation in the Chinese canon, the Jeryul Jing. Suddenly, we were confronted with 4 different versions of this so far ignored little text. Although a source is never mentioned in the Tridandamala, it is at least likely that its editors considered the Shokka Vinodana to be a product of Ashwagosha and therefore included it in their compilation. Now, are there still more traces of Ashwagosha? Again, the answer is a definite yes. In his Ratna Shri, a commentary on the Kavya Darsha, the 10th century Buddhist author Ratna Shri Gnana quotes a stanza as from Ashwagosha. Yatoktam Acharya Ashwagoshina, Kausidyam Yadina Babet Jagati Anartach, and so on. The same verse is also quoted in the Tridandamala. It is not found in any of the known works of the poet, but it is found, interestingly enough, in the Mokshopaya, a non-Buddhist philosophical work of the 7th to 9th centuries from Kashmir. So it may simply be an anonymous Subhashita which was attributed to Ashwagosha at a certain point in time, but it may equally well come from one of his works which are not preserved. And this brings us to our next example. A few months ago, we had another big surprise. In the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that Ashwagosha is famous not only for his 2 epics, but also as the author of several plays. We have very fragmentary remains of at least 2 such plays preserved in Central Asian Sanskrit manuscripts. The Shariputra Prakarana in 9 acts and 1 or 2 more plays, the titles of which are lost. Moreover, in his Vada Nyaya, the philosopher Dharmakirti mentions Ashwagosha as the author of another play, the Rashtrapala Nataka, of which nothing is preserved beyond the title. The Tridanda Mala contains quotations from at least the Shariputra Prakarana, and this was absolutely unexpected, for me even a sensation. So far we found traces of two verses which seem to go back to the Shariputra Prakarana. The first, a Shikarini verse, is preserved in chapter 27 of the Tridanda Mala. Parikleshais taich swaga janagatam akrishya chammano, and so on. We have two problems here. First, the beginning of line 4 in folio 72 is completely out of focus, which renders it impossible to decipher anything. However, enough is preserved to connect the stanza with a fragmentary line in the Central Asian palm leaf manuscript. Here the circle represents the string hole, the double dots, a missing akshara, and the 3 slashes in the end show where the fragment breaks off. This is the second problem. Only less than 1/4 of the stanzas overlap. This I mark in blue. It raises the question whether this is enough text and whether the remains are specific enough for being sure that it is the same verse. I would say yes, it is the same, but before I say more, let me show you the second example. It is found in chapter 19 of the Tridanda Mala, another Shikarini verse, and better legible than the previous one. Yata nishtaptanam trapumadu grita media payasam, and so on. The parallel in the Central Asian manuscript of the Shariputra Prakarana is again badly preserved and very difficult to read. But again, the preserved words are sufficient for demonstrating, beyond doubt, I would say, that this is the same verse. Again, the overlappings are marked in blue. There are several problems. The remains of the Central Asian folio consist of 3 fragments, and the gaps between the fragments must be miscalculated. The crosses, they represent missing aksharas, but there must be more, or either less or more. Heinrich Lüders, who edited the fragments of the Shariputra Prakarana in 1911, 110 years ago, did not know that this was a Shikarini verse, which would have helped him to arrange the fragments differently. This will need much more research. For the time being, it may suffice to show that there are at least 2 verses which the Tridanda Mala and the Shariputra Prakarana have in common. Which conclusion should we draw from this observation? In my eyes, it is difficult to reach any definite conclusion. One possibility would be that the compilers of the Tridanda Mala had a manuscript of the Shariputra Prakarana at their disposal. This is unlikely in my view. More probable is the possibility that they quoted from another source, which also contained these verses. And this brings me to a hypothesis of Kazunobu Matsuda. He thinks that these verses and many others found in the Tridanda Mala come from Ashwagosha's lost Sutra Alankara. This must have been a commentary on canonical sutras interspersed with a large number of poetical verses. There are many anonymous verses in the Mahaprana Paramita Upadesha ascribed to Nagarjuna, which are also found in the Tridanda Mala. The Mahaprana Paramita Upadesha, preserved only in its Chinese translation, is also a sutra commentary. And according to Matsuda, the common source for the verses in the Upadesha and in the Tridanda Mala could very well be the lost Sutra Alankara. So far, this is a working hypothesis, and it will need more research to substantiate this idea, but it is a very interesting perspective. In the context of poetry, there is one more finding which I would like to present to you. I mentioned the Pravarana Sutra. Immediately after this sutra, the third danda begins with a set of 10 verses which follow the principle of ekottarika, groups of waxing members, and describe the monks holding the pravarana. I show you the 5th verse as an example. Pancha skanda viraktanam panchendriya vibhavinam panchanga viprahinanam tesham adya pravarana. When I read them, the verses immediately reminded me of a stotra. The Tibetan canon contains the translation of an Ekottarika stotra, which, according to its colophon, was written by Matracheta, another famous poet. Recently, and luckily, a Sanskrit manuscript from Tibet has become available, which preserves the original of this stotra. And here too, the colophon tells us that Matracheta is the author. The 5th verse in the stotra reads as follows. Panchaskanda viraktaya, panchendriya vibhavine, panchanga viprahinaya namah, panchanga garichite. All the other 9 verses follow the same model. In the Tridanda Mala, they end with the refrain, Tesham Adya Pravarana. For them is now the Pravarana ceremony, while the stotra has the word namas, homage to, and another epithet. They are clearly related. The question is, which of the two was first, the hymn or the version in the Tridanda Mala? I think the answer is definite. The stotra must have been first, if only for the reason that all the terms are well-known epithets of the Buddha, but not normally of the monks. What we observe here is the adaptation of a stotra to a specific use in a ritual context. In linguistic terms, this was easy. All the compilers had to do was to transfer the singular and the datives of the stotra into the plural and the genitives necessary in the Tridanda Mala. A final thought. Is there any connection with Ashwagosha? Interestingly, from a certain time onwards, Ashwagosha and Matracheta were identified with each other in the Indian Buddhist tradition. This seems to be a late development. Atisha mentions it in the beginning of the 11th century, and the Prasada Pratibodhbhava, the second of Matracheta's 2 famous hymns, is credited to Ashwagosha in its Tibetan canonical translation. If the Tridanda Mala is a late compilation, and this is a possibility to be reckoned with, its compilers may have drawn on the Ekottarika stotra in the conviction that it was also written by Ashwagosha. There is much more to say about poetry in this text, but time does not permit to do so. I come to my 6th topic, ritual, and here I will discuss and try to answer the question, what was the purpose of this peculiar collection? To anticipate the result, it appears that the Tridanda Mala was something like a textbook for rituals, not a manual, because it does not contain any instruction on how to use the single chapters or their specific purpose. Why do I think this is a textbook for recitation on specific occasions which demand a rite or a ritual? There are 3 independent indications which lead me to such a conclusion. First, a description of the Tridandaka in the Vinaya of the Mula Savastivadins. Second, similar texts with the same structure. And third, a common feature of many of the sutras contained in the Tridanda Mala. In a paper dealing with monastic funerals in the Mula Savastivada Vinaya, Gregory Chopin quoted a passage from the Kshudaka Vastu, where the Buddha prescribed the funeral ceremonies that had to be performed for a deceased monk. At the end of the burial, the monks should recite the Dharma of the Tridandaka, the text says, and then dispersed. Chopin added a lengthy footnote where he collected all the available evidence on the Tridandaka, especially the fact that the Chinese Tripitaka preserved a translation of the Anityata Sutra, translated by I Ching around 700 Common Era, with the title Wuchang Jing, and the alternative title, this is very interesting, San Qi Jing. The former, Wuchang Jing, possibly being a rendering of Anityata Sutra, and the letter of Tridandaka Sutra. Moreover, the same I Ching in the record of his travel to India described a recitation which consisted of 3 parts. First, praise of the 3 jewels. Second, the recitation of a holy text. And third, a formal transfer of merit. All this led Chopin to the conclusion, quote, all of this would seem to argue for identifying the Tridandaka with the Anityata Sutra. But there are still other indications that would seem to suggest that the Tridandaka was not, in fact, a specific text, but a kind of ritual formulary into which any given text could be inserted. Looking further, end of quote. Looking further, Chopin found indications that the Tridandaka was also used on other occasions. For instance, when venerating and circumambulating a chaitya, further in connection with the fortnightly recitation of the Pratimoksha, and perhaps unexpectedly in the ritual required before cutting down a tree. All this fits perfectly well with the Tridandamala. Apparently, the Anityata Sutra translated by I Ching is an example of a chapter of the Tridandamala, in this case, chapter 11. There is another one, which I already mentioned. This is the Jieyu Jing, a late translation by Fatih in the 10th century, which contains the Shoka Vinodana. Both translations involve a number of problems, but this is not the moment to discuss them. When we consider the Central Asian transmission of the sutras contained in the Tridandamala, there is one conspicuous factor which they seem to share. Many of them are preserved in a higher number of manuscripts. I mentioned the 50 manuscripts of the Pravarana Sutra, and some of them are preserved in several so-called Sammelhandschriften, composite manuscripts, which unite sutras from different sections of the canonical scriptures. Quite often, these composite manuscripts also contain non-canonical texts like dharanis, ritual texts like donation formulas, and so on. It is not a new assumption that these composite manuscripts serve for ritual purposes, for instance, apotropaic ones. If correct, it nicely corroborates the idea that the Tridandamala is a collection of 40 such sutras designed for the use in various rituals. Regrettably, we know only 2 applications where a specific sutra was used, the Anityata Sutra in case of the funeral of a monk, and the Pravarana Sutra, obviously in connection with the Pravarana ceremony. The Tridandamala itself informs us of neither the specific purpose of a chapter nor when and how to recite it. These matters must have been everyday knowledge for the officiating monk or monks who employed the text. They were not deemed necessary to be written down. I'm nearing the end of my talk. One last point remains, the question of authorship. Was the Tridandamala written or at least compiled by Ashvaghosha, as the colophon wants us to believe? Most likely not. Here we have to agree with Johnston, it seems. The Tridandamala is not a kavya work, it is a work designed for a practical purpose. But it draws extensively from works of poetry, or perhaps much more accurate from poetical works of Ashvaghosha. He is the only author who is notably represented. Other famous poets like Arya Shura or Haribhatta, to name Michael Hahn's favorites, are conspicuously absent so far. Bhadracheta, a poet especially renowned for his Buddha stotras, is a problematic case, as we have seen before, but so far there's not a single quotation from one of his two main works. Let me end with a telling contrast. First, I give you a quick survey of the identified non-canonical verses and their parallels. There are, as mentioned before, 4 verses from Gopadatta's Ajata Shatru Avadana. There are 6 verses also found in the Subhashita Ratnakarandaka Katha, a text ascribed to Arya Shura, but this is a late compilation. It has nothing to do with Arya Shura himself, but there are verses of the Jatakamala found. 1 verse found also in the Hitopadesha, 2 verses also attested in the Panchatantra and in Subhashita collections, 5 verses also attested in the Sadharma Parikatha. This is, as you remember, the parallel manuscript being edited by Peter Daniel Santo, and 1 verse found in Vararuchi's Shatakata. In contrast, these are not many verses, right? In contrast, let's recall Ashwagosha's contribution. The Buddha Charita is quoted, and the Soundarananda, altogether about 350 stanzas. Then the Shoka Vinodana, consisting of 40 verses ascribed to Ashwagosha. Then the Shariputra Prakarana, an unknown verse also found in the Ratnashri, possibly verses from the Sutra Alankara. And finally, the Ekottarika Stotra, if the compilers took the name Matracheta for nothing but an alias of Ashwagosha. Altogether, this is a massive amount of text. Moreover, it is impossible to say how many of the still unidentified verses also go back to works connected with Ashwagosha, for instance, the Lost Place or the ominous Sutra Alankara. For the time being, and this is already my last sentence, we are left with an unsolvable puzzle, but already now Ashwagosha is the undisputed central figure in the poetical parts of the Tridandamala. And I am very sure this would have immensely delighted not only Edward Hamilton Johnston, but also our friend and teacher, Michael Hahn. Thank you very much.
For this
have to
wonderful talk.
Let me
Yes, I think the content sharing has ended. So, yeah. So
is the screen unshared?
Yes.
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 Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you very much for this wonderful talk, and really very interesting text. And I just wished, I mean, in last, I mean, July, Professor Hartmann was supposed to be here in Pune as a Kensei Foundation visiting professor, and to read with us this text. This is what we planned, but then due to the pandemic, this could not be actualized. And I really feel sorry, but I'm really happy that today at least we got some flavor, some kind of a glimpses into the text. And I'm also happy that I think Professor Matsuda is also here in the audience, and so is I think Peter Santo. So I'm really happy that all these scholars are here, and today we could just get some glimpses. But these are I think enough to kind of arouse more interest in the text. And now actually I'm looking more eagerly, looking forward to Professor Hartmann's visit to Pune than before. So thank you very much, Professor Hartmann, for giving this wonderful talk and for introducing this text to us. Now, as I promised in the beginning, we can take some questions or comments. So is that okay, Professor Hartmann? Should we go ahead with the questions and answers now?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So if there are any questions, maybe Talat, you can announce the name if there are any hand raised or any questions in the chat box.
Yes, of course. Yes.
So if there is anyone who would like to put some questions and want to know more, please feel free. This is the time.
Yes. So right now I can see one raised hand. Gudrun Maljar. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name.
Please go ahead with the question.
So please, yeah. So please, you can ask your question.
Yeah,
Gudrun,
I
Mr.
hope you.
Maljar. Yeah.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, of course.
I have two questions. The first one is how many verses remain unidentified? And the second question is which other Mula Savastivada sutras are quoted? Yeah, that's it. That's all.
Hello, Gudrun.
Hello.
Thank you for asking a question which I cannot answer, the first one. I didn't count.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, this is, as I said, I tried to say, it's still, it's work in progress. And we have not read every section. And of course, there are sections which we will not be able to read in this, with the help of these photographs. So it's impossible to reach a definite figure, but there are quite a few. Especially we have not, I find this interesting, of the Vandana verses, to the homage to the triple gem in the beginning of every chapter. We couldn't identify a single one. So it's impossible to say if they are taken from another source or composed by the compilers or editors of the text. So the total number of verses, to answer your question, is at the moment unknown to us. And the second question is easier to answer. Just to give you a couple of examples: Paramartha Shunyata Sutra, Anityata Sutra, Dashabala Sutra, Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra, Dvajagara Sutra, and so on. And these are exactly the sutras which we find in composite manuscripts.
Yeah, and in the Samyuktagama, so are there many Samyukta?
Yes. One, I think this is, you are probably indirectly asking for the Agama Sutras.
No, I am more asking for Samyuktagama.
Yeah, then it's, this is the right direction. Samyuktagama and the lost Ikottarikagama could be a possible source, because the sutra quotations, they are not, usually not very long texts. And these, the sutras used for ritual purposes, they are not the Agama Sutras normally, but much shorter ones as those contained in the Samyuktagama. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I think there's one more raised hand. Please go ahead with the question.
Hello. Hello. Please ask your question.
Kazunobu, can you hear me? Please ask your question. Or please say something about the number of verses.
Mutsuda, please ask your question.
We cannot hear you, Kazunobu.
He has unmuted herself or himself, I don't know, but they are not saying anything else. Yeah, please go ahead, Mutsuda. So we are unable to hear their voice.
Kazunobu, I don't hear anything. It's a very vague sound, which may be your voice, but it doesn't really reach us.
I think there's some technical issue at this end.
There's a technical issue.
maybe we can come back to Professor Matsuda's question again, but if there is any other question in the meanwhile, we can go ahead with that. So if there is any more raised hand, please.
No, right now there is, yeah, one, yes, one raised hand we can see. Mikhail Radik, please ask your question.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for a fantastic talk, Uwe. A more general question about the sutra content of the text. I take it that you haven't yet published anything on this text. Is there any plan to publish a hand list of the texts that you've identified?
Hi, Michael. It's great to see you. It's not quite correct. I haven't published anything so far. There are papers in the pipeline, but Kazunoubu has published, for instance, this whole chapter 15 of the Buddha Charita. But of course, this has not so much to do with the sutras. We have an internal table of contents, I would call it. So it's, of course, possible to give you information, but it's not published. Of course, it has to be published. This is one of the most pressing matters, I would say. I mean, this is a lengthy text and is a difficult text, and the verses which we cannot find in other sources, they are sometimes very difficult and sometimes partly blurred. Which what can you do with that? So it's not easy to take decisions.
Thank you.
Professor Matsuda, I think you can give it a try one more time.
Yeah.
No, I think we still have a problem. Okay, so any more questions, please?
No, right now, no any raised hand in the lobby. So if anyone is interested to ask question, please raise your hand in the lobby, please. So still we could not get any raised hand. So
Professor Hartmann, may I ask a question in the meanwhile? If so, I mean, what is your feeling? So I mean, it seems that this is a collection of different tridandas, right? I mean, this is how we look at the text now. And in that case, I mean, do you really see a kind of a connection in the topics? How are they arranged? I mean, if you just go by sequence, do you see a kind of a logical sequence of the topics or the of these three dandas?
Very good question, Mahesh. I don't see it. So yeah, I think that's all I can say about that. It's just, I would say, just a compilation of 40 sutras which are used in ritual context, but without trying to, or if there is an order behind it, I don't see it. So what I see is that a sutra which is used for during the burial of a monk, it will be used more often, most likely, than a sutra which is used for the pravarana, and then a tridanda which is used for the pravarana, which is once a year. So it seems, but there's also no practical order in the sense of rituals which happen more often or necessary more often. And again, we normally in only 2 cases do we know the connection between the ritual and the chapter. So it's very difficult to say anything about that. And it's regrettably, I checked a while ago, I checked the Tibetan text of the Mula Svastivada Vinaya, the various sections. There are quite a few mentionings of the ritual of the cutting a tree, but they don't give the text, which would be appropriate on that occasion. So we can only speculate.
And just something connected. Are there any? I mean, because this is you said it's used for rituals. So are there any other procedural details about the ritual, or is it just a kind of a text to recite?
It's only the text itself, only the recitation. Nothing, no instruction whatsoever. On first sight, you would not think this has anything to do that this could be connected with ritual use. There's no indication whatsoever in the text itself.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Now, Professor Mark is waiting. Please, Professor Mark, please ask your question. Professor Mark. Hello. Professor Mark. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. He has muted himself. So please, if you are hearing us, then please unmute yourself and please move on. No.
Again,
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Ube?
Yeah,
Yes.
so next one is...
I'm Matsuda.
Yes, please. Yeah, please, Professor Matsuda, please go ahead.
Please,
yes,
please
we can
on.
hear you now.
Now we hear you.
But I'd like to tell the good additional information. Correctly, in Tridanta Mara, 24 sutra from Samyukta Agamas are included, and 2 sutra from Madhyama Agama, and 2 non-canonical sutra, Prasena Jidugata and Chaitya Pratakshinagata, and others are probably from sutras from Ekottarika Agama. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katsunobu.
Okay. Now next I saw Professor Adam. Please, you just raised your hand, but suddenly you have put down. So please ask your question. Yeah, Professor Adam.
Thank you very much indeed for this illuminating talk and survey. I wondered if you could just maybe briefly comment on the range of scripts involved. We're looking at hearing about these texts through the medium of the scripts used in the manuscripts. And I just wondered, from the manuscript in Tibet and the Central Asian fragments, and any interesting issues you had in the handling, anything noteworthy or distinctive in the handling, in the processing of these scripts. I just wondered if you had anything to briefly give a flavor of the scripts involved when you were looking at these manuscripts.
Thank you for the question. I did not hear everything, I'm afraid. But what I heard, you were asking about the scripts of the Central Asian manuscripts, is that right?
Yeah, it was just to give a flavor of the different types of script.
Speak a little bit louder, please.
Yeah, it was just to give. I just wondered if you could give a flavour of the different range of scripts involved in looking at these. You know, you mentioned the manuscript in Tibet, I think from the 11th century, and then the Central Asian from a lot. Just to give a flavour of the range of different scripts involved, and any distinctive issues, anything noteworthy that you specifically to mention about. Thank you very much.
Yes. In Central Asia, it's all the fragments were found at the northern route of the Silk Road. We have the northern and the southern route. Northern route is dominated by canonical Buddhism, southern route by Mahayana Buddhism, and so it's all the manuscripts are in the relevant manuscripts are in the standard northern Turkestan Brahmi, as we call it. And this is a script quite stable for a couple of centuries. There's the one exception which I mentioned in connection with the Pravarana Sutra, where we have a palm leaf manuscript, which according to the material material must have been imported, and according to the script, it was written in northern India. So it's a Gupta script, we call it, and possibly to coming from the 4th century. The script of the Tridandamala manuscript found in Tibet is a much later script. Possibly, it's very difficult. There is no, as far as I can see, we have no reliable guide like Lore Sander's book on the scripts of the Turfan text. There's nothing comparable with regard to the late Indian and early Nepalese manuscripts. And so it is, I would say it's not it's within the normal range of these scripts of the 11th, maybe 12th century. I'm not a specialist on the scripts of that time and of northern India. So this is just with a certain hesitation, but there is a very vague indication that the manuscript could have been in the possession of Atisha. But this is very complicated and very speculative, I would say, but if correct, it places the manuscript into not later than the 11th century. Does that help?
Thank you very much
Yeah,
indeed. Yes, I just wanted to have a flavour, because we were talking about these texts, but we're always accessing them through the medium of the script, and just wanted to have a little bit of a flavour. So thank you very much indeed. Marvellous research.
Thank you very much. I think Mark Allen has joined back. So Mark, can you please ask your question if you wanted to ask?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please.
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, the connection is very bad. I think I just dropped out, but I think you just answered the question about the date of the manuscript. Is that correct?
The manuscript of the Tridandamala.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
Possibly could be the 11th century.
Okay, fine. But I get a sense from what you've been saying, and I may have missed a bit, but that this Tridandamala is not necessarily a fixed text, but it's a structure. It's a structure for ritual performance. So I suppose the question is what you are seeing in this manuscript just a snapshot of a constantly changing text?
Very good question, Mark. Exactly. That's what that's the impression you get if you compare the Anityata Sutra, translated by I Ching, and the corresponding chapter in the Tridandamala. The verses are different. Also in I Ching's translation, connected with Ashwagosha, but not the same verses. So exactly as you say, this is an indication that the contents are fluent. At least the sutras will be stable, but the verses before and after may have to do with the predilections of the monks using this manual. So this is my present impression and explanation. So the question, if this was a manual, many monks must have had something like that. So why do we have only one single manuscript? This is, I find that difficult to answer that, because usually if you look in, are you in Australia just now?
I am, yes.
Yeah, great that you're still awake. Thank you very much.
That's okay.
But if you look in Australia in a household, or in Germany, you will find a Bible in every household. So in 1,000 years, if the texts are recovered, there will be Bibles everywhere, because this is a practical text for everyday use. So why don't we have more texts similar to the Tridandamala?
Yes.
I find that intriguing, but I have no answer.
Yeah. Could you not ask that question similarly to about the Buddha Charita, though, even though that's a literary text? You know, that is, these are just the vagaries of history. I mean, it's clearly the fact that the text you're talking about quotes it and other, literary, kavyas by Ashwagosha shows that they were popular and well known, but we don't have many manuscript witnesses to them.
Yeah, this either tells us something about chance, that all the manuscripts we have are in a way chance finds, which survived due to lucky circumstances.
Yes.
There must have, I'm sure there must have been many manuscripts, many more manuscripts of like Buddha Charita and Soundarananda. Yeah, I think that may explain both. The non-existing other manuscripts of the Tridandamala and of the Buddha Charita as well.
Yeah, just to go back to the way you responded to my first question, which is you said that the verses changed, and that may have been up to the choice of a monk, but the suttas are the same. But surely, if the sutta, say, you said that the Nityata Sutta may have been used at funerals and so on, but these things come and go, these fashions or inclinations. So what leads you to think that the sutras, their inclusion of particular sutras was fixed?
Perhaps it's simply the inclination to believe it. You're quite right in questioning it. There's no indication whatsoever, except that we have the same sutras in other ritual contexts. But even there, but there too in Central Asia, we don't know the specific purpose of every sutra collected, every sutra contained in such a composite manuscript. We have no idea either. So it's very looking at it from a more rational angle, it's very likely that not only the verses change, but also the sutras, according to changing predilections of sponsors, monks, or whomsoever.
Yeah, good. Okay, thanks.
Welcome. Sleep well, Mark.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark, for really being a part of it. So thanks a lot. If there are any more questions, maybe we can just take one or two more and then we'll stop. So are there any more questions, comments?
Yes.
I don't see any
Yes,
raised
yeah.
hand.
Yes, we can see one raised
Yes,
hand.
please. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Sophie Florence, please ask your question.
Hi, Professor Hartman. Thanks for the amazing talk. I had a question about the finds from the missing section of the Buddha Charita. So I wondered if there were any surprises in these found verses, particularly against the reconstructed passages, other than like the basic kind of things that it would have been missing in translation.
Hi, Sophie. I'm not 100% sure that I understand correctly what you're aiming at. So the situation is as follows. We have the first half of the Buddha Charita in Sanskrit, second half disappeared. We have a Tibetan translation and we have a Chinese translation. So when we identify verses of the second half of the Buddha Charita, this is only possible with the help of the either Tibetan or Chinese translation. So what we do is seeing how well the Tibetans understood the Sanskrit. Sometimes or often quite well, and sometimes not so perfect, perhaps. But that is maybe, is that an answer to your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that is. I think that it means that I had thought that the I had misunderstood the methodology, I think, but that does answer my question.
Mm-hmm. No, but this was just, I can tell you the story, how I remembered, how I identified the first verse. I remembered that I had read similar contents a while ago in the English translation, in Johnston's English translation of the second part of the Buddha Charita. And so just to make sure, I checked and was totally surprised to find indeed a Buddha Charita verse, Sanskrit Buddha Charita verse.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And now we got used to it, but in the beginning it was absolutely thrilling. Quite a sensational feeling.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, welcome, Sophie.
Any other last minute question?
Yes.
Yes,
now
please.
Maheshwar Singh. Yes. Maheshwar, please ask your question.
Thank you, sir, for delivering such a beautiful lecture. I have a question regarding the restoration from the different sources such as Tibetan and Chinese. According to your point of view, how much it is relevant or useful to restore texts from Tibetan or Chinese?
This is a difficult question. Thank you anyway. I think this depends a lot on the purpose why you do it. For academic purposes, its restoration may not be absolutely necessary. And a restoration shows how a translation always shows how you understand a text. So it's useful, of course. But poetical Sanskrit with this tremendous amount of synonyms, endless amount of synonyms, very different from the Tibetans, from the Tibetan language. Tibetan has a very restricted reservoir of synonyms. So you can never be sure if you have a Tibetan translation, even if it's a verbal, what we consider a verbal, very close translation, you can never be quite sure in a poetical text. It's easy to reconstruct canonical texts because they have their formulas. But
yes,
you don't have these formulas in the poetical texts, and especially with excellent poets like Ashwagosha or Haribhatta or so, you can never be sure about the exact wording And so a reconstruction of a Sanskrit verse from the Tibetan or the Chinese, it shows your understanding, but the same would be achieved with an English translation. And so on the other hand, it's if your Sanskrit is good enough to do it, it's a nice exercise.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm not, I don't want to argue against it. That's the point. No?
Thank you very much for this last point. Yes, so I think we have been here for long, and I know that all of you have joined from really different parts of the world, from different continents, with different time zones, and I'm really happy and that all of you have joined us today. And I'm here now just to propose a formal vote of thanks. First of all, let me thank Professor Hartmann for really accepting this invitation. In fact, I'm pursuing him, for long, and so I'm really happy that today Professor Hartmann is here with us and he could give this talk. And I think, fortunately, the technology worked fine, and we had no problems in seeing his presentation and also hearing him. So yes, Professor Hartmann, thank you very much, and I hope that we'll soon find an opportunity to actually read this text with you, as we had earlier planned in July. That invitation is of course still there, and I'm just waiting for the right moment, right time, when you could visit Pune or and have this session with us. And I think then all of you again, because now through all the internet facilities, all this will be available for everyone. So I'm really thankful to you. I'm also thankful to all the members of the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies and the Deshana Institute for joining hands and organizing this event in the fond memory of our teacher, Professor Hahn. I mean, even though he's not here, but I think due to him and his blessings, we are always being connected with good people and good scholars. So I would really like to express my deepest thanks to Professor Hahn. I'm especially thankful to Talat for organizing this, the technology part, and to my office staff also for circulating the information. I'm especially thankful to the Kensei Foundation for also publicizing this news on their portal. And many others whom I don't know. I mean, they have circulated this information, and today we had all the people could take the advantage of this talk today. So thanks to all of you, and thanks for joining in. And once again, with our deep homage to Professor Hahn, I take your leave here, and have a nice day ahead, and be happy and be safe. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks a lot. We'll now stop the meeting here. So thanks for joining. Yes. Professor Hartmann, thank you very much. And once again to you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
And
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
everything
much,
worked
Professor
well.
Hartmann.
Now he left.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, the remaining sir.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you
Okay.
very much to you all.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Mitsuyo is here.
Thank you.
I saw her
Yes,
last time.
Yeah.
Mitsio is there here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I couldn't notice her.
No,
Thank you.
no.
Yeah.
I
Thank
saw
you very
it late.
much. Yes. Yeah. All the colleagues from Marburg as well. I saw
Yeah.
Roland
Thank
there.
you, Mitsuyo and Roland. Yeah, for joining us.
Thank you.